Hello. My name is Obi Agba, and we are the members of the Committee on Lectures.
My name is Max Kuehler.
We would like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. Iowa State University is located on ancestral land and territory of the Bakudzi, or Iowa Nation. The Iowa States obtained the land of the Meskwaki and Sauk tribe in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the 17,000 Native people who lived in Iowa today. We would like to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's talk, ISU chapter of Young Americans for Freedom, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by student government.
Okay, and now a few housekeeping items. The university bookstore is on site and selling copies of Dr. Lindsay's book. Their table is set up in the lobby outside the room. You can use a credit or debit card or your ISU U-Bill account to purchase a book. Dr. Lindsay will be signing books after the lecture. You can line up along the front of the stage. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please note there is a microphone set up in the aisle for you to use. That was funny. Please do not use a flash if you are taking pictures. If you leave before the Q&A is finished, please exit quietly and refrain from talking until you have left the room. A lectures program student worker in the hall outside of the room to scan your student IDs if you are here for class credit. Card scanning will not commence until after the lecture is finished. Finally, I'd like to briefly announce an upcoming event. On Wednesday, November 30th, ISU Assistant Professor of Political Science, Dr. Scott Feinstein, will give a lecture, Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. Monsters and Myths. This talk will be at 6 p.m. in the Sunroom. Last, all lectures events are free and open to the public. A full schedule is available on the lectures program website.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alex Kinnaman, Young Americans for Freedom Chairman here at Iowa State University. YAF is the premier conservative outreach organization on campus, aiming to advance the conservative movement and promote our views of strong national defense, traditional values, free enterprise, and individual freedom. To learn more about our organization, you can head to our Instagram at YAF_Iowa State, check out our student organization page, or feel free to talk to any of our members after this event. On behalf of our executive board, we are glad you're here. I want to say a special thanks to anyone who has put time and resources into this event. Without the help of everyone involved, this would not have been possible. I would also like to thank our volunteers working tonight and the Young Americas Foundation for all the resources, financial or otherwise, that it has provided. This event will have an open questionnaire period after the speech. If you wish to ask a question, please follow the directions of our volunteers. Please remember to keep your questions concise and respectful. Finally, be advised that disruption of any sort will not be tolerated. We ask that you please silence your mobile devices. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. An American-born author, mathematician, and political commentator, Dr. James Lindsay has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. Dr. Lindsay is the founder of New Discourses, an organization dedicated to shining the light of objective truth in subjective darkness. Dr. Lindsay is the co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why That Harms Everybody, and is the author of his new book, Race Marxism. He is a featured guest on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Joe Rogan, and NPR. Please welcome Dr. James Lindsay.
Hello, everybody. Bear with me as I start a stopwatch so I don't talk for 3 hours. So it's exciting to be in Iowa. This is a 42nd state I've got to visit. This university, as a matter of fact, is a somewhat important university in my intellectual journey. You may not realize that. I don't actually know if the character I'm about to reference is still here at Iowa State. He wrote a book and published it in 2016 that I read that was instrumental in me understanding what it is that we're dealing with in the country, especially with regard to education today. But his name is Isaac Gottesman. If he's here, say hi. Isaac Gottesman wrote a book called A Critical Turn in Education, where he explained how Marxists took over our education program as a kind of proud history book. And it comes right here from Iowa State. So my appreciation to him, I think that many of the remarks I make tonight are actually going to be reflective of knowledge that I gathered from this specific institution, which is kind of cool. It's only now and then that I get to kind of come home. I got to speak in Madison, where critical race theory was invented at one point, and that really got the audience pretty excited to know that they were, part and parcel with such an important piece of history. Since I've never had actually a talk that I've given start with a land acknowledgement, I'd like to acknowledge the land acknowledgement first. I'd like to acknowledge what the political purpose of land acknowledgements is for everybody. If you don't know, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States prohibits the search and seizure, the illegal search and seizure of private property. It protects you from that. It does not apply to stolen property. So if in fact we believe that we are on stolen land, the university can go ahead and give that back to the federal government whenever it wants to. That's the purpose. So I've never had one. Glad we got to have one of those. I hope it adds clarity to you why those things are occurring at the schools that you attend, the places that you visit. But I'm here not to talk about land acknowledgements. I'm here specifically to talk about critical race theory. In fact, the title of the talk is Critical Race Theory is Race Marxism. It doesn't mince words. There is some context to why I'm here. Apparently, you here at the university hosted Nikole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times, or more technically, formerly of the New York Times Magazine, but she is the creator and lead author of something known as the 1619 Project, which sought to write what's known as a critical historiography, which is not a piece of history. It's a piece of history about history, a little strange academic distinction. She wrote the 1619 Project, or organized and wrote on the 1619 Project in order to reinterrogate the history of the United States and to frame it in terms of systemic racism. As a matter of fact, the foundational claim of the 1619 Project is that in the year 1619, slaves were brought from Europe and Africa both and landed at Jamestown. And the Jamestown colony started off with slavery, establishing the United States as a slaveocracy instead of as a future democratic republic. And her contention in that project is that that essential character of the nation has never changed, that political systems don't transform without a political revolution, which has not occurred, save the American Revolution, of course, which took place in 1776. But in 1776, in the project, she argues that that war was actually fought, our war for independence in the United States was actually fought specifically to maintain slavery, where that was not the case in Britain, although that was still the case in Britain at the time. So her claim is that the War of Independence in the United States was fought to maintain slavery, to maintain the slaveocracy that characterizes our country, and that therefore, as a result, the country is still indelibly stamped from the beginning, as her associate Ibram Kendi phrased it, with systemic racism. And so I'm not a historian. I'm not here to debunk the claims of the 1619 Project. That would be inappropriate for me to do. It has been done thoroughly. I actually want to tell you that it would miss the point. It's very important that these things happen, that historians debunk the claims of critical historiographers or other revisionists of history. It's very important that we study to the best of our ability. Obviously, history is not a perfect study. It's something very difficult. You have to fill in a lot of gaps. You have to make a lot of guesses about people's motivations, about the way people thought, about the things that happened that didn't get written down. But credible history, as important as it is, cannot actually debunk the 1619 Project, because the purpose of the 1619 Project was not and is not to introduce credible history. The purpose of the 1619 Project is to introduce what critical race theorists refer to as a counter story, an alternative history to be set against the given history in order to complicate and confuse and say that there are other sides to the story that have to be considered on equal ground, regardless of whether or not they're historically adequate or accurate. And if you don't understand the point and the purpose of the 1619 Project, you'll miss the point by thinking, oh, we'll just debunk the claims. And then history will be, clarified and we'll move forward. Maybe it made some good points, maybe it didn't, and we'll get to the bottom of it. That's not the point. The point is to introduce a counter story, to introduce doubt into the mind of people, not on the factual level, but on the moral level, that this country was founded for good reasons, with noble ideals, etc. It's, in fact, to bring into question ideals like that we believe that all men are created equal and that they have certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which Thomas Jefferson used as a proxy for John Locke's earlier life, liberty, and property, which brings me back to the land acknowledgement. And we start to understand what the purpose of this critical approach to thinking, critical approach to analyzing the area that we're in, literally the physical location, or the history of the nation, or the state, or of the land upon which we stand. What the purpose of that is to introduce an alternative story that enables the people who present that alternative story to position them as the moral superiors of everybody else and thus take power over that. They never, and I mean never, position themselves as the epistemological superiors. They don't know more. They don't have more accurate knowledge. They have more moral knowledge. They think that they are better than us morally, and thus they are entitled to rewrite our history and to rewrite the history of our future going forward. This is the project going back to Karl Marx, who believed that he had discovered the true science of the study of history. In fact, the true study of history. He called that science the Wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, the scientific socialism. His belief was that human beings were in fact created, or in fact they created themselves as socialists, perfect socialists, in other words, communists. And that through the invention of private property, the social contrivance, the social construction of private property, that human beings estranged themselves, from each other, one man to another, each man to himself. This introduced an alienation, a feeling of alienation, that we live in an alien world that's been constructed by somebody else. It's not our own world. The way that we understand the world is not what it really is. But this is just a recreation of a very old esoteric religion known as Gnosticism in the political and economic context. But he claimed that what he had actually articulated was the true study of history, not just history as it is, but history as it is meant to be going forward, the total story of history and its purpose. History has a purpose to it. This should be history with a capital H. Has a purpose to it. And he and people like him alone have discovered the right and true purpose of history. And it is to return to where we began. You know, that snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. That's the symbol. It's to return at the end to the beginning and find that the beginning is the end and the end is the beginning. It's a circle that completes itself and finds at the beginning its own end and at its end its own beginning, as his intellectual mentor Georg Hegel said. And that end point is communism. We started as communists, we invented private property, and we return to communism when we transcend private property as human self-estrangement. That's how he phrased it in the economic and philosophic manuscripts he wrote in 1844. So what Karl Marx actually proposed isn't an economic or a political system at all. It's not a social theory in any regard. Those are myths. Those are mystifications, if we want to borrow his language. What he proposed was a religion. He proposed a theology. He proposed an ontology of man, what it means to be man. Man as a being that knows he's incomplete and knows that he can complete himself. So he identified what it means to be conscious. And what it means to be conscious is to be conscious of how the system operates such that it disenfranchises some people or alienates them or estranges them from themselves and others. To become conscious of the suffering that comes through systemic oppression. And the people who are conscious, therefore, understand the nature of that and can seize the means of production of society and of man. And when they seize the means of production, they can make a new society and thus a new man. And we can achieve the end of history as it was intended by returning to communism, no longer local in tribes with estranged people, but now global. Man is the person who is meant to create and complete man. That's Karl Marx's answer to what it means to be human. Man is the person who is going to create and complete nature, to make it fit for man. He called this humanizing the world. Man is the creature who exists to create and complete the perfected communal society and return to what he called our species being, which means that we are a species that lives for the species. In other words, communists. This is his religion. And when you understand what Marxism is, it becomes very easy to understand what critical race theory is, and it'll shed light on my comments about Nikole Hannah-Jones and her fraud. So what is Marxism then? Marxism is ultimately the belief that we're supposed to be communists, but certain among us came up with this social contrivance called private property. That social contrivance created what he called the division of labor. The division of labor estranged men from men. It stratified society. The people who had access to the special form of private property, productive property, sometimes called capital under his view, were the haves, and they therefore had power. If I have, say, a microphone, or if I have a cell phone, or if I have a podium, or I have a car, or I have a house, or I have the means of production at a factory, and you want something that I have, or if you want to be able to go buy something of your own, then you have to do work for me. No longer can you be the creative being that you were meant to be. And creative is multiple meaning there in all of the ways you can think of. You can't be the creator you were meant to be, because to be your creator, you have to be able to do your work uncompelled. He says, in fact, in the economic philosophic manuscripts, even the compulsion of a hungry belly means that you're not engaging in free, spontaneous work. And that free, spontaneous work enables you to do what? Create a subjective vision, he says, something animals can't do. Create a subjective vision in your mind of the thing you wish to make, and then to make it, and then to see yourself reflected in the humanized object that you created, and to know yourself to be a creator. He called this the dialectic of subject and object. You as a subject envision an object, you create the object, and in the object you see your own subjectivity. And the circle comes back to where it started. And you know yourself to be a creator. But if you're making something that I want you to make, you're estranged from that. You're estranged from your essential nature, not just as a socialist, not just as a communist, but as your ability to be your own creator. And I'm maybe saying that with a capital C this time. Why? Well, let's say that you wanted to make, I don't know, a picnic table. And so you have a vision of your mind, in your mind of a picnic table. You go cut down the tree, you saw the wood, you get the nails, you do what you have to do, you screw it together, you nail it together, whatever it takes to build a picnic table, you build a picnic table, and you see yourself as the person who designed and created that picnic table, and you're proud of it. I'm someone who can make this. This is an object fit for human use, for human need. I can sit at it, I can read at it, I can eat at it. I can invite friends. I can do all kinds of human things at this table. Animals wouldn't do that. They don't need to. They're not interested. That sets us apart. That makes us not mere animal matter, not mere fallen matter, but something higher. But if I decide, wow, I'm good at making picnic tables, and I would like to make my design for picnic tables kind of go gangbusters, so maybe I'll make lots of picnic tables, but I can't do all the work. I've got the cool design, I've got the cool carpentry tools, and I'm like, hey guys, I'll give you $10 an hour to take this lumber and assemble it according to these plans, or $20 an hour, or $50 an hour. And Karl Marx writes copiously about the contrivance of money. It's a false thing that you're working for so that you can go out and buy the needs that satisfy your basic means of existence. But the thing that you're not doing when you're working for money to build my picnic table is working to build what's in your head. And you wouldn't be doing it if you didn't need to eat, or if you weren't chasing that Corvette, or whatever it is that you wanted to buy. So you have needs, real or false, imposed upon your life. And the only reason you're doing work for me instead of realizing who you really are, which is a creator, is because I have stuff, namely capital, which means I have surplus, and I can hand over that surplus and share it with you. But you have to do my bidding, and you have to build my vision, not your vision. So you no longer are bringing your subjective vision into being, you're bringing my subjective vision into being for me. And so I've robbed from you your ability to see yourself as a creator and placed you instead as a worker, which for Karl Marx is no different from a form of slavery. Doesn't matter how much I pay you. I could pay you $1 million an hour to make picnic tables, and you're still a slave. And I've estranged you from your true being, and I've set you against me, and I've set you against each other. You're competing to, say, rise up in the hierarchy. You're competing against all your other coworkers to get the promotion, to get more money, to be more successful, to make more of the tables, whatever it happens to be. And then I'm your slave master. I'm the person that you come work for. So we're intrinsically at odds with one another. And the whole society is actually structured this way, according to Karl Marx. The whole society is structured this way because the people who have constitute a class, and the people who don't have also constitute a class. They all have something broadly in common. And when you start to think of people as a class, you can separate the society into the classes of people who have, which he called the bourgeoisie, and the class of the people who don't have, which he called the working class, or when they become conscious of the nature of reality, the proletariat. This is his vision of how society works. It's a dismal vision. It's not a realistic vision. In fact, it's a completely unrealistic vision, because his vision at the end of the day is that if we really took advantage of the fact that we're producing surplus through our ownership or through our interaction with nature, then we would share that surplus freely, and nobody would actually have to do all that much work. If you wonder why things don't work in communist countries, it's because at the end of the rainbow of the communist vision is nobody works. The thing you're aspiring to, if you are a communist, is not working. So surprise, those countries don't work. But because they say communism only works when everybody is a communist, they can blame all the people who aren't communists, which inside those countries they kill for their insurrection, and outside those countries they use as a scapegoat to keep the communist war machine running. It's a horrific ideology. At its very bottom, though, you have two pieces. It's not complicated. Everybody thinks because they wrote thousands and thousands of pages of literal garbage that communism is deep, that it's insightful, that it's complicated. It's not. At the very bottom, it's very simple. There is a social construction of a special kind of productive property. Certain people created that social construction to grant themselves access to it and exclude everyone else from it. The people who have access are privileged by their access and thus gain power. The people who are excluded are oppressed by their lack of access and their needs to work to obtain partial access or temporary access to it. Society is intrinsically put into conflict by this. The people who are in charge to manage that conflict create a broad mythology, a story for why this is the way things should be. Karl Marx's word for that is a word we talk about all the time now, not knowing where it came from. It's ideology. Ideology is the set of beliefs that the people in charge create for themselves and that they teach to others so that they accept the status quo. Communism builds itself as the sole answer or end of all ideology, which is a cute way to hide the fact that it's a horrific ideology. It's the only one that's not an ideology, folks. So you have special property, you have haves, you have have-nots, you have an ideology that justifies it, that structures reality. Reality is to be understood in terms of all of its forces. History, that science of history, that wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, tells us that everything happening at this moment had myriad causes in the past. And you have to understand all of the causes, and only Marxism can do that. Only Marxism understands the true causes. For example, in the 1619 Project, the causes of racism in 2020, 2021, 2022 trace all the way back to 1619, when allegedly, as historians strongly challenge, slaves came over on a boat to the Jamestown colony. I won't get into historical nitty-gritties, I'm not one, but I will state that that is a strongly challenged claim by historians, that they were not, in fact, even slaves. So that the origin of the whole system structures that system, it orders that system, and that the causes of the things we see today are at root due to the division brought in by the creation of the system and its maintenance through the ideology. So Marxism is the belief in a special kind of productive property called capital. As I said, the bourgeoisie are the people who have access to it, and the proletariat, or really the working class, are the people who do not. They become a proletariat when they are conscious of the structural classism that actually orders and maintains their society. An ideology of capitalism backed up with meritocracy. I earned this, I worked hard, I got educated, I showed up at 6 a.m. every day, yada, yada, 7 days a week, no days off, like the guy from Home Depot just said. I earned this is an ideology that explains why the haves get to have and the have-nots don't get to have unless they go work hard too. At which point, if they worked hard and climbed the ranks and became a member of the bourgeoisie by first adopting the bourgeois values, by the way, this is a huge conspiracy theory, and they get let in to the bourgeoisie, then they have adopted the bourgeois values. They have adopted the perspective of the haves, and they have abandoned the have-nots, and they've not improved their own life so much as made the entire system worse for everybody. And this dehumanizes everybody involved, because if you're on the bottom side, you've been dehumanized by the fact of oppression, and if you're on the top side, you've been dehumanized by the fact of being an oppressor, even though you don't know it. Those people on top tend not to know that they're oppressors. They are willfully blind or willfully ignorant to that fact. They adopt a false consciousness about the circumstances of the world. Only a Marxist or a class or a critical consciousness could reveal to them what's actually going on. Outside of bullshit political theory, we call that cult initiation. Only the cult initiates can see what's actually going on. Only they know the real truth. Everybody else only knows the partial truth. They've been misled by their priests. They've been misled by their bosses. They've been misled by their parents. They only know a part of the truth. But the cult knows the real truth, the whole truth, all the truth they don't want you to know. And that structure, according to Karl Marx, of society structures the people in that society. It's deterministic upon their character, as a matter of fact. The doctrine in classical Marxism is called material determinism. You hear the determinism. It determines who you are, which class you're in. So that if you're in the bourgeois class, you have bourgeois values. You see the world through a willfully ignorant bourgeois lens. If you're in the working class, you have some kind of fatalism or you have whatever else, but you also have the oppression baked into you. You accept it. You internalize classism. You think it's right and just. You think if you just work hard enough or whatever, maybe you can climb up, so you've internalized the bourgeois values. This is called material determinism, and it structures your character. The actual terms that Karl Marx used for these things specifically, for the creation of the society, man creates his own society, Karl Marx said, is called praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S, praxis. It's putting theory into practice. Whichever theory happens to be the dominant theory, capitalism or whatever. You put it into practice, you build a certain society. But he said, because the circle comes back to where it began, there's also the inversion of praxis. The society shapes the man. That's your material determinism in Marxism. It determines who you are. It determines how you think. It determines your values. It determines the range of your subjective imagination, which is the base of your capacity to see yourself as a creator. So it limits you and makes you actually forget who you are. Prevents you from seeing who you really could be, which is a maker and shaper of history. But if you awaken together as a class, as a proletariat that's awakened and motivated and revolutionary, you could actually grab or seize the means of production and thus transform the society into one that overcomes all of this, because you know the purpose to history. So these are the two pieces. The society is structured in a certain way, and the conscious deserve to take control of it and guide it toward its intended end. That's it. And I've already said, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but it's the conscious are the members of a cult that have been initiated into seeing the world this way. And that everything that goes with a cult, as hard as it is to get somebody out of a cult, goes along with this. So that's Marxism. Property is capital. Bourgeoisie are the winners. Proletariat are the conscious losers. The working class are the unconscious losers. Haves and have-nots, however you want to phrase that. The ideology is capitalism. It creates structural classism that is materially deterministic. The way to get out of that is to stage a revolution and to establish what a disciple of Marx called a dictatorship of the proletariat, to establish a complete control state under the power of the awakened working class, to destroy the capitalist state and replace it with a socialist state, which Marx said in the long whiles of history would eventually realize it's not necessary. that it's redundant and would wither away of its own accord. Vladimir Lenin remarked that that would happen when the state reached its maximum of power, is when it would relinquish its power, when it would cease to be necessary. Okay, so that's Marxism. Why did I go off on this huge tangent about Marx to talk about critical race theory? Because in critical race theory in 1993, Cheryl Harris wrote a paper called, and this is a pinnacle paper in critical race theory. It's a foundational pillar, I should say, of critical race theory. She wrote a paper called Whiteness as Property, and she explains that it is a form of bourgeois private property in the cultural domain. So now you have a form of private property called whiteness. Certain people have established whiteness, specifically to justify slavery, say in 1619. They established whiteness in order to justify their white supremacy over others. That's an ideology of how society should be organized. And they created a set of winners, white people, and the people they accepted, model minorities, white adjacents, so on. And then the people they excluded, who are called people of color, especially BIPOC, black and indigenous people of color. So they stratified society according to a line of race dynamics as opposed to a line of class dynamics. But the special form of property is explicit. It is explicitly given as whiteness, as a form of property by Cheryl Harris in 1993 in the Columbia Law Review. So that's a special form of private property that, keeping with Marx and the Communist Manifesto, must be abolished. Remember when like Coca-Cola was telling us we needed to be less white? Remember all those things that were like abolish whiteness? Karl Marx in the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto tells us all of communism can be summarized in a single sentence: abolish private property, abolish whiteness. It's the same theory. It's just a different model. Like I said, the winners are whites and the people that they consider white. The losers are people of color, in particular the BIPOC. The ideology, I said, is white supremacy, and it orders society according to something called structural racism. Structural racism is where you see that the structure of society itself is racist, not necessarily any individual. Not even necessarily any individual in the past, although we all know that there were many racist individuals in the past who had great amounts of influence. The claim is that the structure was set up by those people using racism as a tool, and this is the key part, that's not false. In many regards, that was true. Although I disagree with Miss Jones, I strongly disagree with Miss Jones, that when Thomas Jefferson wrote that he thought that all men are created equal, that he aspired to believe it. And his other writing bears it out. He claimed explicitly in his other writing, in his letters, again, I'm not a historian, but I did bother to read some biographies of Jefferson in my life. He claimed explicitly in his other letters that he wanted to solve the problem of slavery and he didn't know how, and that he was racked with guilt about kicking that can down to a later generation, which, if you know anything about Jefferson's thought, debts, whether moral or economic, were the last thing in the world he believed should be kicked down to a later generation. Thomas Jefferson, actually, he was talked down by James Madison as a point of historical interest, proposed that the Constitution should include a provision that every 19 years that the Constitution is rewritten and that the entire national debt is paid to zero so that no generation inherits any debts, whether intellectual or financial, from previous generations. He was that obsessed. James Madison said, Tommy, that's a bad idea. Let's not put that in the book. And luckily, Thomas was in Paris and James Madison was in Philadelphia writing the Constitution and just left that part out. So he was very much against the idea of debt. I take it very seriously that Thomas Jefferson meant what he said when he said that he believed that all men are created equal and aspired to get a country where that was upheld. I think he meant it. I think he was racked by the challenges and complications of his time, unlike Nikole Hannah-Jones, who thinks that he's just part of a system that doesn't know how to overthrow itself. Because this is the key point. That structure remains in place until a revolution by the conscious takes place, and they seize the means of production of society and thus man to transform it into a new frame. Marx said they would transform the dictatorship of the proletariat, would usher in a socialist state, which by definition is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. Critical race theory claims that what we need is to achieve racial equity so that we can move on to racial justice. The definition of racial equity is the racial component of what's known as social equity theory in the public administration literature, citing H. George Frederickson, for example, and his comments on the Minnowbrook Conference from 1968, where social equity theory was brought into public administration officially. The definition of social equity is a administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. It's the same definition as the definition of socialism. How weird, how strange that equity and socialism literally mean the same exact damn thing. How strange that they are literally the same thing. How weird that these people who are so proud of their religion would rebrand it to something to hide the fact. And what did Karl Marx say would happen with socialism over time? It would eventually work out its contradictions, and it would eventually become spontaneous, and the state would eventually wither away, at which point we would have a new era called communism, which is true socialism, which is socialism that has transcended private property entirely. And what does racial justice look like? Ever heard a single person tell you what it looks like? No, you haven't. You just hear them say, we don't have it yet. It's equity made spontaneous, where you no longer need the administering body to put it out. It is the completion of equity, just like communism is the completion of socialism. It is when racial difference and racial inequities have been fully transcended because of the full abolition and transcendence of the private property of whiteness. The ideology that's put in place, as I mentioned, to uphold this unjust society according to this framing in critical race theory is called white supremacy, and it creates structural racism or systemic racism. Structural racism and systemic racism are, guess what? Materially and structurally deterministic. In other words, our racial behavior is racial praxis that creates and maintains a structurally racist society, even if nobody in it is any longer racist, and even if none of our institutions are racist. The structure maintains itself because we've all imbibed a bit of the ideology. Charles Mills, who was a critical race theorist that recently died, Charles Mills called it the racial contract. He said that everybody's kind of bought into this, even though they've never heard of it. Literally, he says, even though they've never heard of it, they've all bought into it. And it's an implicit social contract that white people will keep white people up and keep people of color down for their own benefit. It's a structural dynamic that takes in all the factors of history, like the 1619 Project, to understand the world that we find ourselves in. And that can only be overcome by a revolution that installs an awakened leadership to install not socialism now, but equity that will mature into justice. I'm going to actually read to you, by the way, something from Ibram Kendi. I don't know if you know who Ibram Kendi is. He is not a smart man. Ibram Kendi wrote a book called Stamped from the Beginning. If you haven't read that book, I mean, you should. You should know what people are saying, but don't bother. The fifth chapter, though, I want to say is dedicated. He has 5 characters. He writes 5 characters, stamped from the beginning. He has 5 people he picks to describe the history of America, to include or to indicate that it's been stamped from the beginning by structural racism. And the 5th person he chooses, he gives 100 pages to, is the communist Angela Davis, who left the Communist Party USA after 2 failed attempts to run for vice president on its ticket because she said it was too conservative. He also wrote a book in 2019, very famous, called How to Be an Anti-Racist. He tells you at the very beginning how to be an anti-racist on page 19 if you need to look it up. What he says is that it requires anti-racist discrimination. He says the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. It is an explicitly, intentionally discriminatory program so that shares can be adjusted so that citizens and groups are made equal. Racial socialism. That's equity. That's his program. But in 2019, he was also on the back of this runaway best-selling book, who was also asked by Politico magazine to explain how to solve inequality. Big ticket item for a man of his intellectual stature. And so he writes, it's 1 paragraph, I'll read the whole thing to you. See if you hear something that sounds like a dictatorship of the anti-racist proletariat anywhere in this. To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines two guiding anti-racist principles, and I will point out, as I love to, that he misspelled principles. Racial inequity is evidence of racist policy, and the different racial groups are equals. I don't think anybody has a problem with the second of these, but that first one, that we're going to interpret all differences in outcomes as evidence of racism, might be something a little bit too far. But he goes on, he says the amendment would make unconstitutional, not just illegal, unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials with racist idea and public official clearly defined. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA, which does not stand for Dictatorship of Anti-Racists, I promise, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. The Dictatorship of Anti-Racists would be, the DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity, monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. Sound like a dictatorship? It only has power over every local, state, and federal policy, every private institution, and every public official to make sure that the things he doesn't want don't happen. What's the thing he doesn't want? He doesn't want shares to be distributed in a way where citizens and groups aren't made equal. It's a dictatorship of the anti-racists. But to put a punctuation mark on it, the DOA would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. So they can punish you for not going along with this. So this is the Department of Anti-Racism is the dictatorship of the anti-racists. The point of it is, just like under Marxist socialism, the goal is that if they institute this state that has the power to impose its will on the people, that will create the praxis, they call that in the slang doing the work, that will introduce the praxis that transforms the society so that it transforms the people in the society until they come back to who they were in the beginning, which is anti-racist communists. That's why I call critical race theory race Marxism, and that's why Nikole Hannah-Jones has to write a 1619 project to try to frame out the entire history of the United States as being intrinsically built off of slavery and racism that doesn't go away until she and her cronies hold a revolution and get to seize the power and create a constitutional amendment, etc., that's going to enforce their rules on every level of policy, every private and public official, with punitive powers attached to it. A department of the government that has power over all of the other branches of the government and the states and the local jurisdictions and individuals that we're supposed to pretend isn't a complete and perfect reiteration of the dictatorship of the proletariat, now branded anti-racist, to abolish whiteness rather than capital. So critical race theory is race Marxism. It's that simple. When you understand what Marxism actually is, and you understand that it is Marx's belief that man creates society and that society then in turn creates man. So people who are conscious about how society is created and where it should go deserve all the political authority to make sure that that praxis creates the society and that society creates the people who will create the kingdom on earth. When you understand that, all you have to do is realize that Karl Marx believed that economic conditions determine one's character, and critical race theorists believe that racial conditions determine one's character. And you see they are the same exact theory almost to the letter. If they're the same exact, I really shouldn't call them theories, theosophy down to the letter, the results are going to be similar. I often get criticized that I just point out that critical race theory is a form of Marxism, and that I don't say why Marxism is bad. I don't know how many dead bodies we need. I don't know how many murders we need. I don't know how many thought reform prisons and gulags we need. I don't know how many absolute catastrophes of collapsed nations we need before we realize that communism doesn't work. But if you want to know why it doesn't work, its creator's vision was that it will create a world where nobody works. Nobody ever has to do a single damn thing they don't want to. And that the surplus that we extract from nature through our spontaneous activity will be plenty for all. Now, there's another component, and I want to come back to my friend, Mr. Gottesman, who is of this institution. There's another purpose for the 1619 Project and its inclusion of critical race theory, and that's educational. The 1619 Project was not merely put out as a magazine article from the New York Times that won a Pulitzer that is in every bit as much dignity as the one they gave Walter Duranty for covering up the starvation of the Ukrainians by Stalin in the Holodomor. By the way, the New York Times still holds that Pulitzer. Walter Duranty was working for Stalin in Moscow, and he wrote an article saying Russians hungry, not starving, to cover up the wholesale starvation of anywhere between 3 and 9 million Ukrainians in the 1930s. And they gave him and the New York Times a Pulitzer for this. And you would think maybe not immediately, but maybe when Khrushchev stood up and confessed to the crimes of Stalin, that maybe the New York Times would say, hey, Pulitzer Commission, we want to give this one back. It's still on the wall. And now they have one for the 1619 Project, and I don't think that there's a lot of daylight between their infamy. The disgrace to the New York Times for both of those Pulitzers is impossible to speak. That's how I feel about the fraudulent 1619 Project. That's how I feel about its fraudulent, corrupt, manipulative creator, Nikole Hannah-Jones, who was invited at roughly 10 times my take to speak at this university last week or the week before. That's your tuition dollars if you go here. That's what they're going to. Oof. I think that's, the kids call that big oof energy or something like that. Like top oof, maximum oof, OOF, oof. It's UF in Spanish. That's cultural appropriation, kids. Stop doing it. I'm just kidding. It's funny. It's an educational program. That's what it was created for. It immediately spun out, not just as a magazine, but as an ed program to be taught in our schools. So Isaac Gottesman tells us what the point of the critical turn in education was. It was to bring critical theory, critical pedagogy into our schools. He says by 1992, by the way, the colleges of education had been completely captured, and that had been completely successful. By 1992, I know that y'all are young, most of you in this room, but for the older ones, let them all have their moment of pain when I point out that that's 30 years ago. 1962 is the same distance away from 1992 as today is from 1992, just to put some color on that for you old folks. I'm just kidding. I was a teenager in the 90s. I know. It's an educational program. What Isaac Gottesman says is that the purpose of critical pedagogy was to bring Marxist theory to the classroom. In fact, it wasn't just Marxist theory. The subtitle of the book is From Marxist Theories to Post-Structuralist Feminism to Critical Theories of Race, which is funny because we just spent 2.5, 3 years listening to the television tell us every chance it got that critical race theory is not in schools, where it's literally named as one of the 3 projects that was brought deliberately into schools to transform them into a deliberately critical Marxist program, as Isaac Gottesman records it. That's one of your professors here at this school, or was, maybe not now, I don't know, I didn't look that up. Critical pedagogy is based off of a Marxist educator by the name of Paulo Freire. It was imported by an educator, it's Canadian-American, by the name of Henry Giroux. He brought it in mostly in the late 1970s through the mid-1980s until it became, as Isaac Gottesman puts it, located where it's found today, quote, everywhere by 1992. Critical pedagogy, in Paulo Freire's view, has a particular program. It is to replace literacy education, literacy construed broadly, with political literacy education. It is to politicize education. It is to make education political. It is to use, in fact, in Paulo Freire's framing, subjects as generative opportunities or generative themes, to have political dialogue with students who who are not to be considered students, but are to be considered learners that are as equals to their professors or to their teachers, who are to be considered now not teachers or professors, but educators who are described as facilitators. The lesson itself is merely generative, and as Paulo Freire explains it in Critical Pedagogy, is a mediator to knowledge. It is not the point of a history or a historiography lesson like the 1619 Project. This is where I started, saying it's not the point to give history. It's to give an alternate story, because the story, just like the actual history, isn't a point of knowledge. It is a mediator to knowledge. It is a mediator to a political conversation between the educator as facilitator and the learner as brainwashing victim. There's no other way to put it. If you read Paulo Freire's program and understand it, side by side with Robert J. Lifton's explanations of the brainwashing programs in Chinese thought reform prisons under Mao Zedong, you see that the program is identical. The only difference is that Mao Zedong was trying to use things like struggle and things like study, that's dojang and sheishui. He was trying to use those in interrogation, which I don't know that one in Mandarin. He was trying to use those in order to get people to recognize themselves from the people's standpoint. And actually, it was more to get them to recognize their crimes or violations from the standpoint of the people. Ren Min Li Chang is the standpoint of the people in Mandarin. My Mandarin's not great, but I know a little. Paulo Freire's magnum opus, which is the third most cited book in the humanities and social sciences, it holds pride of place in every college of education in North America. All of them, including the one here, is titled The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It is explicitly given in that book, and his follow-up book especially, The Politics of Education, published in 1985, that the point of education is to induce a political literacy such that the educator and learner together die and are reborn on the side of the oppressed, that they are to experience their own Easter, in his own words. That the Easter on the calendar is nothing but a date on the calendar and commemorative rhetoric, dead with no hope of resurrection, in his own words. That the purpose is to die to yourself as a member of the upper class or the betters or the knowers, and to be reborn on the side of the oppressed. I'm sorry, again, folks, that is the language. Not only does it match the language of what they used in the Chinese thought reform prisons, by the way, that is the language of a cult initiation. That is the language of a cult initiation. And the point of things like the 1619 Project are to be generative objects to mediate the conversation. The 1619 Project turns out to be a gratuitous example of how this works. Let me give you a more subtle example that I got from an actual educator who was being trained in the program called Social Emotional Learning that they use to mainline programs like CRT and queer theory and so on into the K through 12 curriculum, pre-K through 12 curriculum actually now. This is a real second grade word problem. Nobody gets stressed out if you're bad at math. I think you can do it. But I'll show you how the generative model is to be used. And then you can imagine how much stronger it is when you use something like the 1619 Project as a discussion prompt or a paper writing prompt with your educator as facilitator who knows the correct answers to these things. This is a real example that was given in real teacher education, actual professional development. The question, it's a second grade math question, like I said. Johnny is in the car with his mom and dad riding to the amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They have driven 30 miles already. How much further do they have to go? And so everybody can breathe for a second and realize, wait, I do know the answer. It's 12. Just kidding. I'm a mathematician. I can't do arithmetic. If you were actually going to use this as a generative prompt, here's what you would do. Kids, this is the instruction. I'm not making this up. This is the instruction that actual educators learned in their teacher professional development programs. All right, kids, this is the question. It's up on the projector, whatever. Before we answer this question, raise your hand if you've been to an amusement park, because the key for the Paulo Freire dialogical method that's at the heart of critical pedagogy is that it's supposed to raise engagement. See, the 1619 Project is part of a rewrite of Paulo Freire's method done by Gloria Ladson Billings that's called culturally relevant teaching, which is supposed to increase engagement. It's supposed to increase interest and in the end raise a critical consciousness, she says. She wrote 3 papers, by the way, in '95 toward a critical race theory of education, but that's good teaching, a case for cultural relevant pedagogy, and toward a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy or something like this. 3 papers in 1995 on those topics specifically to bring critical race theory through the proliferatory generative critical method into the classroom. So we would say, kids, we want to increase engagement. That's the subtext for the teacher. We want to increase engagement. How many of you have been to an amusement park? Some of them raise their hand. They're 7. They're second graders. Some of them don't. Aha, now you have difference. So now you draw attention to the difference. I see some of you have been and some of you haven't. What are some reasons why some people will have been to an amusement park and some people will not have? Remember, this is a true example that was given in professional development for teaching. What are some reasons why? And eventually some kids love to talk, they love to tell you things, and they're going to say different stuff, but eventually some kid's going to raise their hand and say, maybe not everybody can afford to go to an amusement park. And now you're having a discussion about poverty because the generative idea of an amusement park, which can be expensive, has generated the discussion of poverty. If poverty happens through one of the things that comes up to correlate with race, now you have a discussion about race through the CRT equity lens. Eventually the teacher is instructed to ask, what are some solutions that we could have where this isn't fair? Some people get to go and some people can't afford it. What could we do? And now you're having a discussion about socialist solutions. Make it free. Make the rich people pay for the poorer people. And these are real things that real second graders will generate as possible answers, which are then taken as being kind of like noble child wisdom from before the social conditioning set in that proves that we were really ultimately communists in our true spirit being that can be remembered if we get out of our own adult ways and we stop being so socially conditioned to believe things like that, you have to earn money and pay for stuff to go there. And I bring up the amusement park because it's in that example, but you've all seen the baseball park cartoon about equity, about how you're supposed to not have the fence or rearrange the boxes or whatever else to make equity. And everybody should just be able to go to the ball game for free or look over the fence and get it for free or whatever else. Nobody ever mentions that true fairness would be go pay for a ticket like everybody else because that's how we can afford to keep having games. And if you like to have them, we have to pay for them somehow because it turns out this takes a lot of work that most people don't want to do all the time. It's not just for the love of the game that somebody's out raking the field. There are other actual inroads there. You probably picked up on them. We had a we've had a race conversation, a socialist conversation, a poverty conversation based off of amusement park, but rode with mom and dad, and now we can have, my dad's not at home. My mom's by herself. Now we're having a feminist conversation. I have 2 moms. Now we're having a sexuality conversation. We're riding in a car in order to have fun. Now we're having an environmental conversation. Some kids get to go because their parents say, yeah, let's go. And some kids don't get to go because their parents say you're not old enough. Now you're having a political authority in the household conversation with 7-year-olds telling them that their parents might be overbearing and that maybe the teachers have a better idea than their parents about how children should be raised. This is how the generative model works. And the 1619 project, to kind of wrap back and close on that, is meant to provide an ocean of generative material to introduce equity-based critical race theory lessons as the backbone of classroom discussions. And that's all its purpose is. It doesn't matter if it's factual. It doesn't matter if it said there is cheese on the moon. The point is to make there be a discussion. Just like the presence of a drag queen in Drag Queen Story Hour in their own papers is described as generative, because it gets kids to ask, why are you a boy dressed as a girl? So that the drag queen can reply in their own words, because do boys always have to dress as boys and do girls always have to dress as girls? And now you have a semester's worth after one visit of sexuality conversations, gender conversations, etc., in which the teacher, who knows the correct answer to these things, can facilitate the conversation in the direction of equity, which we remember is the administered political economy where shares are adjusted so that people are made equal, which happens to be the identical definition to socialism, but we're supposed to believe is something new and different because it includes identity categories, not just money. So critical race theory is race Marxism. The 1619 project is a fraud that was designed specifically to engender conversations that create these questions in impressionable minds, K through 20, that's PhD level, And this is what we're wholesale subsidizing and forcing upon our children and our adults in workplaces. And it is a program of Maoist Chinese thought reform realized through the education program due to the hard work of a number of many hundreds of communist educators working like bees since the 1970s through the present day, particularly understanding that if you capture colleges of education, you capture teachers. And if you capture teachers, you capture children. And if you capture children, you capture the future. That's what's actually happening with these funny buzzwords. That's their history. That's where they come from. And believe it or not, it gets worse. Thank you for having me. I won't keep jabbering. I would love to take your questions until they kick us out of here, though. So feel free. Mike's up here. And if you don't have any questions, then I get to leave, and that's awesome. Let me give you a piece of advice from the great philosophical work Spaceballs by the philosopher Mel Brooks. At the end of the film, he remarks, even in the future, nothing works.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Hi, thank you for coming. So you talked a lot about the problems with critical race theory and cultural Marxism and how they're kind of intertwined. But, with that in mind, where do you see our top priorities going forward, like socially and legislatively, to kind of, put forward the best society?
Education, without a doubt. Now, I saw some statistics. We all know there was an election yesterday. There are some people in this room who might be kind of like sweeping some sweat off their brow, thinking things might have gone real bad, and then they didn't. And then there's some people in this room who are like, what the F just happened in my country? Where's my wave? That wave was a puddle. It's probably Donald Trump's fault or something, whatever divisive thing they want us to think. But there was an exit poll. I've heard a challenge to this and its veracity, but I saw it this morning, so it's a bit early, just a caveat before I say, that said that Generation Z turned out in record numbers to this election, which may be true. I saw pictures, at least, of long lines of young people, college students, showing up to vote, and good for you. Certainly when I was your age, we didn't bother. Generation X shrugged. And it skewed 29 points to Democrats in that generation. So what happens when by 1992 your entire education system is caught up by a bunch of radicals who believe that teaching left-wing political literacy is the true purpose of education, and then they have a 30-year run on that? Well, everybody who's, say, 20 showing up to vote for the first time in an election, not everybody, but plus 29 votes for left-wing political causes. So if we don't recover and repair education, the list of things, okay, so just this is a political organization, generally speaking. The political ramifications are tremendous, but that's also generational and a problem. The problem also with not recapturing and fixing our education system and getting critical pedagogy out root and branch, because it has stolen education and replaced it by not even indoctrination, y'all, thought reform, brainwashing, what they called in China Xinao, which means wash brain. That is the program. This causes psychological damage to the point where the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, published in 2019 a paean extolling the virtues of social emotional learning by the title of SEL for SDGs, which means social emotional learning for the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations Agenda 2030. That's literally what those letters stand for. And what they said is that introducing this kind of sustainable and inclusive education, in particular to get children, which they say is their agenda, to understand it is their role to achieve the United Nations Agenda 2030 goals, induces a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of stress and a lot of existential crisis feelings for the children, which, by the way, get them out to vote in large numbers if they think everything in the world is going to collapse if they don't get their political way. And as a matter of fact, social emotional learning is the perfect tool to help them learn to manage the loads and loads and loads of cognitive dissonance that education is now going to provide for them. So we're talking about a program that knowingly causes massive psychological damage to the people that it so-called educates, that it brainwashes, and that they are willfully stepping into that and trying to put Band-Aids on it and programs onto it that make it work better. So I would say that the overwhelming, I know if you're in your 20s right now, this doesn't resonate with you very well, but if you're older, you immediately start to get it. The overwhelming top priority, possibly outside of certain political things, but cultural objective should be to empower the reclamation of our schools and get them back to education, not programming. To get the critical pedagogy, the Marxism, and the back out of the schools, and in fact to start holding accountable the people who stole our education from our society and our children. So education for me is easily number one. For the immediate effects that it's damaging children psychologically, we don't even have to get into the entire issue with gender and what that does to undermine the idea of identity category formation in young people, to break down the boundaries of adult-child relationships such that they're as equals. The educator learns from the learner, and the learner learns from the educator, et cetera, as equals, as Paulo Freire said it in the democratic classroom, which induces personality disorders. We don't even have to talk just about the immediate effects, the political effects 5, 10, 20 years from now. This country will run itself off of a cliff if we don't reclaim education. No Marxist society has ever worked. No Marxist society is ever going to work. It's based off of a Gnostic occult understanding of reality that is false and will crash even a great nation like the United States if it's allowed to go much further. If we don't get education back. It turns out, here's a very important saying for you. It's easy to vote yourself into tyranny. It's impossible to vote yourself out.
Hi, you might be able to tell from my shirt that I am actually a critical race theorist, and I'm not going to get into all the many personal attacks that you've made tonight, the straw man arguments. I'm just going to say that you've misrepresented a lot of things. I'm just going to take two as an example. Counter stories are only there to increase confusion about history, was your argument.
Well, I
And
mean, we can talk
actually-
about how they're used in law if you want to talk about Derek Bell and his crazy stories he wrote, like his epistolaries that he wrote down, where he
Are you gonna
pretended
let
that
me
he talked to
finish?
people who don't exist. No, not right now, I'm talking. We can talk about the different uses of counter stories, but I was speaking in the context of the 1619 project. Now you can finish.
Yes, counter stories in the 1619 project, which I will admit isn't perfect. I'm also not completely a fan of Ibram Kendi, but they are not CRT scholars. But if you are an Iowa State student and you're sitting in the UI student section at a University of Iowa football game and you're trying to be heard, you're probably not going to be heard. That's the idea of a counter story, is, hey, let's just listen to some other people's perspectives. And yet somehow this is turned into, we need to prevent brainwashing. And the other thing that I want to say is that Isaac Gottesman, and it's pronounced Gottesman, was my major professor, and he would be horrified. He would support your right to say these things, but he would be horrified that you're taking his work and using it the way you are.
Well, he can be horrified as all he wants. I read his book 4 times, which is quite the compliment. I was told once, by the way, and thank you for the rest of your comments, that you should never make fun of somebody who mispronounced something that they've seen only in writing because it means they read. Enjoy your evening.
Yeah, I just wanted to say you made some pretty bold statements. Ibram Kendi, not a smart man.
He's not.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, I'm speaking here, let me finish, please, is fraudulent, you said many times. You also grossly misrepresented the Pulitzer history. You acted like the New York Times still stands by that. That's not true at all. 40 years ago, at least, they and the Pulitzer board both acknowledged that at length. But, you know, it's bold of you to say, someone is not a bright man when a lot of what you're saying is essentially just Red Scare, talk reinvented. I also wanted to ask you about your role in amplifying the groomer moral panic, because you're acting like this is, you couch it, I'll admit, you sound like a good, probably guy who went to, did high school debate. You have speak a lot of big words and talk in circles and act like you're saying a lot when you're really not.
I've never done a debate in my entire life.
You
by the way.
sound like someone who did. I didn't say you did.
Oh, thank you.
And
I have one tomorrow or next week
I'm
at
still
Oxford.
I'm still talking. Excuse me.
Oh, okay.
And I want to ask you about why you're getting into the groomer moral panic stuff, and specifically speaking of being intellectually. I mean, I'm speaking about intellectually lazy. I can't think of anything more intellectually lazy, or to borrow your word, fraudulent, than just arguing something that's just completely derivative of past moral panics. Gay rights, satanic panic. I mean, what are you really, saying? It's a good grift, I guess, is what I'm saying.
That was a very clear question. Thank you. Do you want me to talk about the groomers? Is that what you want me to talk about? I want you to tell me what word I should use for this. This is from a paper called Drag Pedagogy that's written by Harris Kornstein. It goes by the drag queen moniker Lil Miss Hot Mess. He's one of the creators and runners of the program called Drag Queen Story Hour. Wrote a paper in Curriculum Inquiry, a leading curriculum journal in all of education. It was published at the beginning of 2021 or late 2020, depending on if you want the online or print version. It says at the end, I want to know what word I should use for people who say that this is the program that they're running. The last sentence of this paper is, we're reading books while we read each other's looks, and we're leaving a trail of glitter that won't ever come out of the carpet, talking about early childhood education. Is that grooming? I can't think of a better word. Let me read from the conclusion some more. As drag moved further into the mainstream, some have questioned whether this queer art form has lost its edge. In discussing the work of Drag Queen Story Hour, you are not talking right now. I'm not speaking in anecdotes. I'm reading to you from an academic paper in a leading curriculum journal and asking you what word applies to what I'm reading. Tell me what word applies to this. We have occasionally encountered critiques that Drag Queen Story Hour is sanitizing the risque nature of drag in order to make it, scare quotes, family friendly. We do not share this pessimistic view. It may be that Drag Queen Story Hour is, scare quotes, family friendly in the sense that it is accessible, inviting to families with children, but is less a sanitizing force than it is a preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. Here, Drag Queen Story Hour is, scare quotes, family friendly in the sense of, scare quotes, family as an old school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. If this is adults going to talk to children in their schools and public libraries to invite them into an alternate mode of kinship outside of their family so they can connect to other queer, quote, families on the street, what word fits better than groomer for that phenomenon? This is a program that is massively funded, that is appearing in schools by the thousands across this country this year actively. This is grooming. Whether you want to call it sexual grooming or not, because there happens or may not happen to always be predatory behavior attached to it, is one thing. This is undeniably ideological cult grooming into the ideological views of queer Marxism, which is its right name. I also appreciate your comments, and I hope you have a good night.
Thank you for coming out and speaking. Very good presentation.
Could you tell me to fuck myself so I feel more comfortable before we continue?
I don't really want to, but... So, by the way, I did...
Okay, groomer.
By the way, I did have... 17 of my great-grandfather siblings did die in Holodomor in Western Ukraine, so I do know how evil this stuff is. My question is, though, in Europe and China, those societies were divided mostly by class, especially in Eastern Europe, very classist societies. In the United States, historically, people have been able to move up. We're not really a class society. We have middle class, upper class, whatever. So would you say that they're more successful right now in dividing by differences in race and like sexuality and gender by using these historical struggles these people had rather than class struggles where they wouldn't be as successful.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I can give you a philosophical historical account of that. If you read, for example, in Herbert Marcuse's writing, Herbert Marcuse, for those of you who don't know, was the leading critical Marxist or neo-Marxist, or just Marxist if you want, of the 20th century. He wrote a book in 1964 called One-Dimensional Man that was published in that year, and by the same date, the following year, in 1965, it sold 300,000 copies, which is a substantial take. If you don't know how many copies books sell, by the way, if you sell 5,000 copies, you're considered a runaway success. It sold 300,000 copies. He was the father of what was called the New Left. And so Herbert Marcuse explains in a series of essays, also One-Dimensional Man, but particularly in an essay he wrote in 1969 called An Essay on Liberation. He explains explicitly that what had happened in Western nations is that advanced capitalism, as it were, that advanced capitalism stabilized the working class. He says, in fact, that capitalism delivers the goods, that it gives people a better life. This was he had concurrence from his colleague in the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer. In the same year, 1969, he gave a television interview where he explained that he devised critical theory for a particular set of reasons. And one of the things that caused them to devise the critical theory to challenge Western hegemonies was, in fact, that Marx had predicted incorrectly that capitalism would immiserate the worker. But in fact, it allowed them to build a better life. And that's what he says. So Marcuse explicitly says that what's needed is a new working class. That's his words for it. He doesn't say a new proletariat specifically. He says a new working class. And that this new working class would be found primarily outside of the traditional working class, which had become stabilized, conservative, and even counter-revolutionary. Those are also his words. He says that the place to look for that would be primarily in the racial minorities, but also in the sexual minorities, the outsiders, and the political dissidents. And he also said that the best place to get the ideology, the Marxist understanding, the two-dimensional understanding or critical understanding of reality into their minds would be by radicalizing college students to bring the theory to those groups. So he explicitly calls for an identity political Marxism that looks at things in a different way, that looks for that, he calls it the vital needs for revolution are located in those minority groups. He did not actually, in that directly start these kind of identity political movements. Critical race theory and intersectionality can largely be said to have arisen from the 1974 to 1979 era where the Combahee River Collective, I know my critical race theorist in the back is going to say, no, as Derek Bell's Race, Racism, and American Law from 1970, or as Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins from 1991, or maybe it was the conference that used outside of the University of Madison, or University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1989, which took place in a convent in an austere room that was decorated with crucifixes here and there, which she, and I quote, said, this is Richard Delgado I'm quoting, said, an odd setting for a bunch of Marxists. That's his words, not mine, describing the creation of critical race theory in its foundational conference in 1989. But the Combahee River Collective put out a statement, a manifesto in 1977, and unabashedly explained, it was a black feminist socialist organization, and unabashedly explained that the seat of the revolution would be, in a Marxist revolution, they're quite clear, or neo-Marxist revolution would be found in the fusion of the various oppressed identity groups, which it grew from there. And in fact, several of the people who were founders at the conference in 1989 that founded critical race theory were at least conversant with members of the Combahee River Collective before that. So I think it's undeniable that this is Marxist, but it did shift. This is where I mentioned Gloria Ladson-Billings actually said that in her paper Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education in 1995, that her characterization of critical race theory is that it's supposed to be a way of thinking that makes race the central construct for understanding inequality through, of course, a lens that's going to be roughly Marxist. And then Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, usually understood to be the founder of critical race theory, said that she called it critical race theory at that 1989 conference. She gave it its name because they were critical theorists. In other words, as Isaac Gottesman says, critical Marxists. That's his word for the critical theorists, is critical Marxists. That they were critical theorists who were interested in racial equity issues, and they were racial advocates who were doing critical theory. So the name critical race theory made sense, which places critical race theory unambiguously in the critical theory story. And the critical theory story by the professor here, whose name I mispronounced, Isaac Gottesman, is better known not as neo-Marxism or Western Marxism, in his own words. It's better known as critical Marxism, with the emphasis on that last word. So we find critical race theory firmly in the tradition of Marxism that way, and we see that the antecedent of that would be the calls from Horkheimer and especially Marcuse saying that the working class had been stabilized by advanced capitalism by the 1960s, and that the vital needs or the vital energy needed to bring about a revolution would be found elsewhere, namely in the identity politics domain. By the way, the Combahee River Collective is also the organization that first named identity politics as we use it today. So when people say that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was identity politics, that's a distortion. The term was not used in that way until the Combahee River Collective explicitly called for it in the late 70s.
Thank you.
So I've heard this said multiple times. It's a statement that the only institution in the United States that was probably the closest ever to being systemically racist was the Democrat Party. Would you agree with that claim? Or what would your response to that be?
I mean, I actually do think that that's a little bit complicated and a little bit unfair. There are excellent reasons if we wanted to adopt their principles that an organization stays as it was founded, to accept that. Certainly the KKK came out of the Democratic Party. The party switch that allegedly occurred in the 1960s is complex and overblown, but it was also definitely the case that there was a big shift toward civil rights for the Democratic Party in the 1960s, and a big shift toward reaction to that in the Republican Party, especially in the South. So that's actually a somewhat complicated history. But if we accept their terms, then unambiguously, absolutely, the Republican Party was the one that ended slavery, and it's the one that had the first black members of Congress, I mean, just down the line. So if we accept their terms for how something becomes structurally racist, then the Democratic Party fits the bill. I would actually point out, since the groomer question came up, although he left, that the Democratic Party is more easily, arguably, and I don't know how long this has been the case, structurally pedophilic. It's not that any given Democrat partakes in or supports directly pedophilia, but they create a structural circumstance in which grooming and pedophilia are able to occur, which is a much bolder statement in the vein of making bold statements.
This will be Dr. Lindsay's last question. Never mind, that was Dr. Lindsay's last question. Thank you very much
That was
for
the
coming.
easiest question I had all night.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all for coming, even the people who hate me.